Welcome back, everybody. It's so great to listen to all your conversations over lunch. And it's on one hand, and it's on the other hand. And once you think you understand something, it becomes more complicated. And we didn't think of that, and we didn't discuss that. And have you thought of this? So now when you have all these things in top of your mind, please make a little note. I hope to be able to get you in. But time is time, as you know. So let's continue with our next speaker, and we are so honored to have Professor Wilhelm Krull here. As you heard, he had been evaluating the Danish system, and he's the Secretary General of the Volkswagen Stiftung in Germany. So please give him a warm hand, Dr. Wilhelm Krull. Welcome to Stockholm.
Thank you very much.
I hope everything works with the audio now.
Yes, I hope you can hear me, but I decided to have a PowerPoint presentation for today, and as you may know, PowerPoint presentations have their limits and also their risks. Limits in you have to really simplify things, maybe sometimes even oversimplify them. And the risks involved are, of course, that you have to run through all the slides in order to come to the conclusions. And the other risk, at least it occurred once to a friend of mine who gave a presentation based on PowerPoint. And at the end, somebody came to him saying, "How nice of you to show us some pictures. They gave us something to think about whilst you were talking." So let's wait and see. The topic of my presentation is really on quality, originality, and risk-taking. I think most of the terms I will be using came up this morning. I also should say up front, I strongly believe in peer review. You cannot do without it, but we always have to think about how to optimize it, how to maybe also introduce some new elements in order to make it even better. And that peer review is not one of the most over-researched topics, I think has become clear already this morning. One of the studies is by Michelle Lamont from Harvard on how professors think. She has been sitting in numerous panels of the American Association of Learned Societies and observed the behavior in the various panels. And one of her statements goes like this: the peer review process is deeply influenced by who gets asked to serve as a panelist and what viewpoints and intellectual habitus those individuals bring to the table. Biases are unavoidable. And I think if we look at the structural problems and conflicting interests, for instance, even within my foundation, we have, of course, on the one hand, the expectations of the applicants. They want timely decisions, they want a transparent process, they want a comprehensive feedback, acceptable funding rates, and the support particularly also for daring or unconventional ideas. For the foundation, of course, particularly as the private foundation, the Volkswagen Foundation, I must, of course, mention because of the diesel affair and so on, we are different. We are not part of the company. We are, in fact, the result of the privatization of the company. For us, of course, right at the beginning already, the emphasis was on interdisciplinary research, on problem-oriented kind of basic research. So it was quite different from what was being dealt with by the German Research Council or Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And it was always the ambition of the foundation to fund beyond mainstream and also to get engaged in changes to be made with respect to universities' governance structures, with respect to introducing new elements like the junior professorship or the junior research group leader kind of things. And of course, with respect to the peer review system, we have observed or have been observing over time that there is an increasing overload with declining response rates. I could even say, from having evaluated the French ANR and the foundation, the Science Foundation Ireland, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, that things have really worsened over time. So what I give you here, increasing overload with declining response rates 4-to-1. So you ask 4 people and you get 1 review. That is, by the way, a rather nice figure. Many other organizations are now at 7-to-1. And this, of course, is a really serious problem. And I will later on mention a few responses we've been trying to make to this kind of dilemma. Because You see, the really crucial thing is, and it so happened, for instance, in the German Initiative on Excellence, that they also had, under this high time pressure, to get whoever they could get in order to form the respective committees. And fairly often the applicants afterwards were complaining about the review panel members not being at eye level of the applicants, and that tells you something about the whole process, which is, of course, then also in one way or another affected. So the relationship between these three is, of course, crucial for our work in order to see to it that we come up with the most convincing decisions. With respect to subjective influences, as mentioned by Michel Lamont, I think it's important that one really understands the concept of unconscious bias. There is even a small movie made by the Royal Society on this topic, which we don't have time to go into right now. But there are, of course, action points for any research organization in this respect, and they are listed here. When preparing to a committee meeting or interviews, try to sit down and speed your own decision-making process down, because I think it's essential that you also, and that's the main message, think about your own biases. You see, we always see biases in others, as it's stated down there, more often than in ourselves. But it's also necessary to carefully think about what assumptions do I make when I give my respective judgments. And when it comes to review panels or committees, which we are working, well, like Jörn Sandberg was mentioning earlier, we are also working largely with review panels, and the panels are, of course, always a crucial thing. It's nevertheless important also to think about what is called in German the Platts effect. So there are the kind of opinion leaders, or the top dog effect, as it's called, that within a certain group, and I've been observing that ever so often when I was representing, in my early days, the Science Council on review panel meetings of the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. If you have 2 or 3 Germans leading the discussion, and you have then 1 or 2 foreigners, the 2 foreigners who will tell you at breakfast that they do not think this is a viable project will all of a sudden agree that this should be funded because the majority of the German panelists think it should be funded. Another point is, of course, the tendency to risk aversion. I think on the one hand, of course, we are all promoting originality. We would like to see the most innovative and the most daring ideas to be funded. But as in this cartoon, of course, the answer is often your proposal is innovative. Unfortunately, we won't be able to use it because we never tried something like this before. In a committee of one of our funding agencies, somebody even the other day said, I'm always in favor of new ideas, but this one I've never heard of. And there's also another cultural problem, and that is dealing with failures. And we all know that if you do experiments and you have your hypothesis, that you as a researcher are inclined to prove the hypothesis is right, but of course often it's not. And what we come across fairly often is that it's not being published, it's not being communicated, so the error is repeated several times. And of course everybody would like to see this guy up front with the super results, but we also have to live with the poor guy down there with his heroic failures. And we have to acknowledge that particularly experimental science is very much about failures and not just about successes made. And of course, we all know with respect to the predictive validity, past performance is quite a good indicator, but it's not sufficient to just say he or she has done excellent work. We know also that if you compare peer review of applications to peer review of publications, that it's a huge difference, because in one case you're dealing with the results achieved, and their peer review, as Hans-Dieter Daniel and several others have shown in their research, is very reliable. But on the other hand, to predict that this or that thing will become, in the end, a huge success is not that self-understood. As I mentioned earlier, the crucial thing is really the overburdening of leading researchers, or as Peter Strohschneider, the president of Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, recently said to me, well, the two of us, we're always chasing behind the same kind of people. We would like to see the same leading researchers be part of our panels. And of course, in particular, at least that's the German problem, because we have a fairly low share of women in science in particular, that it's an overburdening of these women, because you would always like to have them and even come up with a 50% share of women in a panel, but it's always the problem of these people then to respond to the various requests, and this kind of overburdening is also leading to, let's say, quite some problems for the review process itself. The interesting thing in that respect, at least my experience, is when you ask an eminent researcher, fairly often he just says yes because you are asking. Women always ask how much work is involved, how much time do I spend in addition to what I've already done, and I think that's also a cultural issue we should come back to. What is, of course, for every funding agency, and particularly for a private foundation like ours, essential is that you define the right criteria and that you choose the right assessment methods. It already came up this morning, what can you do with written review, where do you need interviews, where do you need panels, etc., etc. And for us, of course, it is essential that we are open to perform experiments, that we try also in peer review processes to come up with, let's say, new ways of operating the whole thing. Because if we want to stimulate bold ideas and if we want to really support the most creative minds, then of course we also have to think very carefully about what do we actually communicate in this respect. And to give you just a few examples from our portfolio, Experiment is one of the high-risk programs we are running or have been running now for quite some time. It's based on very short proposals, and it's basically meant to really award the grants to those who have the most original idea. So our program managers look at the CV, look at the publication list in order to find out do they have at least the expertise to meet this or that thing. But then these things are removed before the review panel meets and discusses things. But what is crucial in this process is beyond the short proposal, which forces you to really write something new and not to use the copy and paste kind of mode of sending in your next application, is this one. It's a self-assessment sheet. Because we try to stimulate the researchers before they send it in to think about their proposal and how, if they distance themselves from what they have just written, would they view this with respect to objections others may have and arguments they should ask themselves, why is it useful to do this? In the peer review process itself, with this panel which we use, we have also introduced more recently a funding joker, or a wildcard, you could say. Each panel member has one such joker to vote for an application against the majority of the panel. And this changes the conversation quite considerably, because it opens up an opportunity to say, if I can't convince you, I believe in this project. The typical reaction at the beginning was, of course, we want to see this project in particular at the next Status Symposium. But it turned out that if you really want to stimulate the most daring things, then you have to be prepared to actually allow for that. And it's usually not the case that each member uses this kind of joker, but it can be used, and it can be used only once by one of those people involved. And the experience is that it's usually being used twice or sometimes 3 times during a meeting. The other element we've been adding, and it has by now also been taken up by the Austrian Science Fund, by the Swiss Research Council, is a randomized choice to complement the peer review process. So in this process, we are relying on, of course, the peer reviews, the panelists and their expertise to select those that could be funded, and then to select those they want to fund. And after that, of course, we draw the same number of proposals from the entire lot that is considered to be fundable, let's put it that way. So we more or less double the number of grants, but it's not like that, because as the experience has shown, 5 or 6 are also drawn by the lot that have already previously been selected. There will be a comparative study of that, and probably in 3 or 4 years from now, we will know whether there were any differences. One of the matters of concern in this program experiment was, by the way, that despite the fact that we had taken away the CVs and the publication lists, and there were no allusions to the person who had sent it in, nevertheless, there were less proposals handed in by females selected. And my hunch is that has to do also with the way you praise your own originality. Men apparently are less reluctant to do so than women. So that's my assumption, but of course that will also be studied, and we will have to wait and see what comes out of it. Another program very similar to the Wallenberg Fellows is, of course, the so-called Frey Geist Fellowship, which is also a kind of high-trust operation where we award these researchers with the same amount, like Wallenberg does, 2.2 million euros for up to 8 years. The usual thing is that the first period is 5 or 6 years, and then they can go on. And of course, that also requires that you think about very carefully about the peer review process. So when we notice that there are so many people who cannot ultimately write their reviews or come to the panel meetings, we chose, just like the Wellcome Trust did a few years ago as well, to build a kind of college or collegium of some 40 researchers who then agreed to supporting us in this process. And based on the review of 3 to 7 applications, the Collegium meets for the first time to select those that should present themselves, so that we have a kind of shortlisting process. And I think it's pretty clear that the motivation for this constitution of a review college was actually that we would need, let's say, a reliable group of people who are also willing to share risks with us and to also, let's say, get engaged in a positive kind of group dynamics with respect to giving high credits, or as Göran Sandberg was saying this morning, once you have given the money, there is no way of getting it back. So you have to, in one way or another, establish a kind of high trust relationship between these people. What we've been doing in this Frey Geist Fellowship program is that before the panel meets, each one reviews 3, 4, 5, or 7 of these proposals and sends in his or her assessment in advance, so that we get a response unbiased with respect to the Platts effect or the top dog kind of effect beforehand. And it also helps us, of course, to give feedback to the respective applicants. And the crucial question is really the one down here. How comfortable were you in assessing this proposal? Because as you can imagine, with 40 people in this collegium and a wide spectrum of proposals, you need some sort of thinking also about how comfortable am I in making this or that judgment, and that's being achieved through this kind of process. And the two-step selection process itself is something we have been implementing almost throughout all of our programs, in particular also with respect to the interdisciplinary research projects. But of course, we have to also carefully communicate what are the main criteria we would like to see. And here I've just given you one example of, let's say, the more people-related funding, where, for instance, the adequate budget outline is not that essential. The thematic agenda for a project-based project is, of course, extremely important, whilst, of course, for the people-related ones and for the other ones, the originality is crucial. But on the other hand, of course, for the personal related one, the individual qualities of the researchers matter the most. And it's these days absolutely essential that you communicate this upfront also with respect to your readiness to take risks. For instance, in the public agency kind of context, the usual thing is that if it's too risky, it's not being funded. And we have to communicate to the review panel members, you are in a private environment where the private foundation is willing to give a grant to the most original kind of people and proposals. So with respect to the fundamental issues, I would just like to mention, beyond the overburdening, that it's really important also to provide time and space for creativity and fundamentally rethinking of common wisdom. And that we observe, of course, as Gunnar Öqvist and Mats Benner have done in 2012, that there is a tendency to be less prepared to take risks, and that, of course, also implies that there are less breakthroughs. So with respect to the multi-level systems of assessment and evaluation, I think beyond the overburdening, it's absolutely important that you establish a mutual trust relationship with your applicants as well as with your review panel members. And for that, and many of you may know this because I mentioned it several times on other occasions, a culture of creativity needs to be at the forefront. These days, that is not easy to tell because you probably in Sweden or in Denmark come across the same kind of thing. Compliance is the major catchword of the day. Implement more controls and controlling mechanisms, etc., etc. And in my view, this is not leading to a situation whereby we will also be able to deal with some issues of fraud, some issues of misbehavior, which of course do occur in universities and research institutions. The most prominent 3 cases, of course, were with the Max Planck Institutes more recently. So there are these kind of things, but if you pretend that by implementing more policing and more control that can be covered, I don't think that's the right way of dealing with it. So once again, I think we should, as funding bodies, encourage risk-taking, establish high trust relationships with those whom we fund, and I think it all rests on the pillars of a research-friendly governance structure, which, by the way, also makes the difference between DNRF and the Danish Research Council, and we may come back to that later on. And of course, what is also important is that you have this kind of vision, that you see this egg and that you already can paint the bird. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Such an asset for us today to be able to tap your brains from all around Europe. Any questions or comments to Wilhelm Krull's presentation, please? Yes, over there.
So I was wondering, how do the researchers, the applicants, react to this randomization part of the evaluation? Are they happy with it?
Well, the individual researcher that gets funded by us does not know whether he was drawn by the lot or selected by the panel, because for this study it is of course essential that they all assume they are part of the same kind of arrangement. But from within the community we get, on the one hand, quite a strong interest in this, and as I mentioned earlier, the Austrian Science Fund, the Swiss Science Fund, the EMBL is currently considering this. So all those organizations that feel uncomfortable with just selecting what can be done by the respective budget and then closing the shop, they now are moving in this direction, let's put it that way. So there is a positive response.
Yes, over there, please.
I had just one question concerning this joker idea, which is very innovative. It's a kind of exercise in non-conformity. But I just want to ask you whether such a system would be quite quickly exhausted, because once people know about the system, they will suspect any outlier, any people who sticks out, to be just such a joker, him or herself. Or what do you do to match this risk, so to speak? of a joker system?
Well, on the one hand, of course, it is the panelists that have a joker, not the
I know that. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
And within the panel, of course, you see, we change on a rolling basis the members of the panel so that it's not the same panel all over for 10 years. That effect could occur if you have a permanent or standing committee. But with this kind of system so far, it has not occurred that everyone says, oh, I throw my joker on the table, and that people are still trying, first of all, to sort out what can we agree upon. But then you have, with respect to these high-risk kind of things, people who think this is a crazy idea.
Yeah.
And of course, the remaining members, or some of the remaining members of the panel, then often say, I think this is a crazy decision. Let's wait and see what comes out of it. And of course, occasionally, the panel is right. Occasionally, the other person is right. So to give you one example, somebody had a brilliant idea, at least the panelists to a large extent thought that, but they couldn't get a majority on fighting tuberculosis in Africa based on a chewing gum-like kind of device which would be accepted by the people there. That failed, so the chewing gum had to be that big, that's nothing to actually accept. But the researcher from the Tropical Medicine Institute in Hamburg, he learned a lot about what to do, so it's not a complete failure, but of course it's not a success either.
But do you reveal to the panel members that there is a joker in the panel?
Yeah.
You do so, okay.
Yeah.
Have you, a follow-up on that, have you any results from that? Can you say what happened to the jokers? Compared to other?
No, not yet, because it has only been introduced 3 years ago. And as I said, there will be this complementary study which looks into the jokers, into the randomized choice, and compares that with the panel's choice, so that in 4 or 5 years, or 3 years' time maybe, we will have the first results of that.
In 3 years' time, we will invite you back and hear about the results.
Maybe.
Very exciting. Thank you very much, Wilhelm Krull.
Thank you.